put up this little slide here because this is something that followed me from my time in the UN. One of the things we did was to redesign the initial poster to mark the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty at the UN. So our creative people in the Department of Public Information came up with this idea of somebody erasing the word poverty to signify the eradication of poverty. I think it's quite powerful, right? Though kids actually don't use erasers in schools anymore. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of a quiz before we go on. Okay, just general knowledge. How many poor people do you think there are, measuring by extreme poverty, there are in the world? I'll show you. It's roughly 1 billion now. Yeah, it's improved. You can see that that's for 2011. I get a lot of questions and people say, this is 2015. Why do you have poverty figures of 2011? It's simply because we don't have the data. Where do you get data from to measure poverty? You get it from household surveys, and primarily you get it from censuses, and censuses are done once every 10 years. And in the developing world, you're lucky if they do it at all. There are lots of countries that actually don't have censuses. They just don't have the manpower to do that. I like to say that the estimates which the World Bank does to get these figures is statistical magic, because they run it through the computers and they generate these figures to get these figures. Some countries have one data point. You're lucky if they have two. Some countries have no data at all. So they use the best knowledge they can to try to figure out and estimate what it would possibly be in those countries. Now I'll come to the standard by which we measure this, but that's basically the $1.25. I'll explain that a little bit more. And the interesting thing here is you can see where the bulk of the world's poor are right now. Nearly half of the world's poor is in sub-Saharan Africa. And the figure has dropped to 1 billion, largely because of East Asia and the Pacific. Between 1980 to the present, China was responsible for most of the poverty reduction in the world. They started out in the 1980s close to 85%, below $1.25, and they're now around about 15%. So it's a remarkable change. The second region is South Asia, with a quarter of the world's poor. 400 million, that's more than the population of the US. Now, one of the things that drove this remarkable reduction in poverty around the world is the Millennium Development Goals for poverty. And so goal 1 is to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. And the key word there is to eradicate. A lot of people, when they are asked what the first goal is, and they'll say to halve poverty by the year 2015. No, that's a target. So the goal 1 is to eradicate extreme poverty. And that came out of the Social Summit for Social Development, where they pushed for the first time to think about treating poverty eradication as a moral and ethical issue. And then you're familiar with the other 7 goals in the MDGs, and of course you're familiar with with goal 2, which is the achievement of universal primary education. And I like to think of all the goals being interlocked, and that they're interdependent, that if you want to achieve poverty eradication, then you really have to work hard at education, because it provides the foundation upon which people can develop their potential, human potential, become more productive, and then contribute to society and be able to find gainful employment. And things like improving maternal health and reducing child mortality, things that we don't think about. If you have illiterate parents, then the mother can't even read instructions on a bottle of medication, how often or what dose to take and so on. I remember for a long time I was very interested in family planning issues, and lots of countries have found solutions to that. Like, for instance, they would give mothers a necklace, and each day that they took a birth control pill, they would move the colored beads to the other side so that they would actually count the days that they had to take the pill. But if you have literacy, then you really don't need these crude methods of conveying basic information. Education solves that. So let's look more closely at the poverty goal, and you see that we have to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. And here it's interesting to see the target. The original target was $1 a day, and then in 2010 we moved it to $1.25. And what happened was the World Bank actually did new estimates, and of course it took account in changes in food prices, the cost of living, and so on and so forth, and that people actually couldn't survive on $1 a day, that they needed to have $1.25. So the $1.25 is a very, very special measure. It doesn't apply to all the countries in the world, because you'll see that they have these campaigns, and they'll say, why don't you show your solidarity with people living in poverty, and they ask somebody in the US, can you live on $1.25 a day? Try it. It doesn't apply to the US, all right? The $1.25 applies to the very poorest, a group of the very poorest countries in the world, and that's where they estimated the $1.25 poverty index, right? So if you take it out of context, it doesn't work. Now, this year, 2015, is the last year for the MDGs, and they're going to replace it with the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, these Sustainable Development Goals have not been agreed upon. You have them out in the public domain simply because they've released it ahead of the meeting that's going to come in September. And this is the result of what they call the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. And the Open Working Group was set up after the Rio conference in 2012. And it's for the first time, the MDGs didn't have any consultations with the civil society. With the Sustainable Development Goals, they started in 2012, and the process kicked off in 2013. And member states met up with NGOs, met up with civil society, met up with private sector. You think of the group, and they were represented, right? And after going through that process, they came up with these goals, and lo and behold, that's 17 goals. That's what happens when you have a bunch of people in the room, and everybody has a vested interest, and you want to push the issue. You end up with a whole bunch of goals. I personally don't like so many goals, because I think you can cluster the goals so that people can begin to focus more on them, but who am I to decide on this when you have a group of people who have worked very hard on these issues? So the ones that actually concern us today would be the goal to end poverty, and then the other goal that you would be interested in is goal 4, which is on education. Now, because of all the criticism about the original goal for education in the MDGs, people say, oh, it didn't have quality of education and so on. The UN actually didn't see that deficiency, because the UN as a whole knew that the Education for All, which was being run by UNESCO, had quality, and it had held governments responsible to ensuring quality. So it was implicit in the understanding that if they have the education goal, that was a basic, they were challenging governments to say, can you just achieve the very basic goal that we have without thinking about the other goals? Just do the participation, the fact that children can complete primary education, right? And then we'll let UNESCO take care of the quality through there. But because of all those criticisms and the uncertainty, they said, let's put in quality this time, right? So it's explicit. Everybody understands we're not forgetting about quality. All right, what I've done here is I've tried to map the MDGs with the Sustainable Development Goals. Now you can see the relationships. And I put the interesting bits in green. Now these are the new things that never appeared in the MDGs. And the reason is, in the year 2000, we weren't so concerned about the environment and climate change. We were negotiating on climate change, but things weren't so urgent. But right now you see that most of the goals deal with climate change and the environment and sustainability. Now with the open working group, the focus of the poverty goal has changed. Previously it was just eradicate extreme poverty, which is eradicate the people right at the lowest strata of society, the very poorest. Now the goal is to eradicate or end poverty in all its forms everywhere. And what they did was they took the first goal that was in the MDG and they put it back up here, but by 2030 to eradicate extreme poverty. So this, we're dealing with the second half that wasn't taken care of in the first 15 years. And then the 1.2 expands on this idea of poverty in all its dimensions. And here they've reinserted the reducing poverty by half. Now, how do you begin to make sure that these policies work? They say, look, we've really got to have social protection. One of the reasons why people fall into poverty is if they don't have a safety net, if anything happens, the main breadwinner falls ill or dies, then the whole family's security is thrown into jeopardy. So you need social protection. You need social protection when your economy is changing. If you have structural change, or if you have a financial crisis, then people lose their jobs, and before they can find employment, they need some kind of social security. So this is important to make sure that people are, the vulnerable portion of the population is protected from falling into poverty. And you can see all these targets, there are lots of targets here. Now, how do you make sure that people actually can have a part in society? You protect their rights to economic resources, land rights, they have ownership, control over land, property issues, inheritance, and so on and so forth. Right? All these things are the basic tools that they need in order to participate effectively and productively in society. So that's the other target. And 1.5, I think it's quite clear what they're trying to do here. That's again emphasizing the impact of climate change, that we have to improve the resilience of poor people to changes that are brought to them externally, beyond their control. Right? So what happens if they have the impact of extreme weather and so on, and degradation of the environment? You have to be able to help these populations to cope and to flourish and to overcome these hindrances. Now, these are the 5 targets that you have here. Now, when you look at the Open Working Group document, this is very puzzling, okay? So, because you say 1.1, 1.2, 1A, 1B, what's going on here? Somebody forgot to count it properly. Now, they have 2 sets. One is the 1.1 to 1.5, those are the targets. These are the targets for implementation. Nobody tells you that unless you know you've been there and you listen to them, all right? So these are the targets that set for implementation in order to get to the target and the goal, right? So they say you need the mobilization of resources, okay? So pretty. But they put it in because you have to make sure that governments actually get it right, that you can't expect everything to happen by magic, right? Just because you try to achieve its goals. And then to support this, you need the policy framework. And this policy framework has to be sensitive to gender issues, it has to be pro-poor, and then you have to direct your investments in order to create opportunities for people to get out of poverty. So these are pretty self-evident, but they put it in to underline the fact that you need to have these in place. So these are the implementation targets. Now, when you talk about poverty in all its forms, then you ask yourself, what does that mean? Nobody explains to you what it means, poverty in all its forms. So we have to try to figure out what it is. And one of the things that comes to mind is multidimensional poverty. If you look at the $1.25, that's unidimensional. It just means that everybody gets measured by one dimension, income. Your worth as a human being is measured by one indicator. Your deprivation is measured by one indicator. Though you may have enough money, but you may be deprived in other ways. So when you have this new target, which is to look at poverty in all its dimensions, you have to take these other factors into consideration. So I have a list here that includes poor health, lack of education, inadequate living standard, disempowerment, poor quality of work, and threat from violence. Normally, when we look at the multidimensional indicator of poverty, we don't classify a person as being poor. They have just one deprivation or two deprivations, but they have multiple deprivations. So they'll have a combination of, say, poor quality of work, disempowerment, lack of education, lack of access to clean water, things like that. That then would typify them as somebody living in poverty based on the multidimensional measure. Oxford University is actually working quite closely with UNDP to bring this indicator into the mainstream. It's very interesting, the UN, when you listen to the discussion, because a lot of countries don't want anything to do with this multidimensional index because it's casts their country in a very poor light. When you look at income, like for instance, China, they reduced the poverty rate from 85% to 15%. End of story, right? But when you look at multidimensional poverty, all of a sudden that figure can jump up. Because if you look at people who are suffering from the negative impact of climate change and pollution, for instance, then a whole bunch of people who are just on the margin will fall back into poverty. Now, the other benefit of a multidimensional measure is that it's more nuanced. You can look at poverty more objectively, and you can begin to tailor your responses to suit the sort of deprivations that people suffer. If a community lacks access to education and say there's poor quality of work, then you say, oh, you know what those problems are. You're not going to spend a lot of money doing something else which they don't see as a problem. And this is what happened in the early days with the World Bank when they first started on development. Somebody in Washington, D.C. would sit down with a minister in a country and say, oh, we've got this ton of money. What's really good for growth is if we have A, B, and C. So they go out and they do that. And communities say, what are we doing with this? We'll have this equipment rusting in the garage because nobody uses it, right? So the idea with the multidimensional poverty measures is that you have a better handle on what is lacking, what is needed, and how to reach out to communities. But I can say that the World Bank has changed since then. So now, one of the interesting things that came out of the World Bank's studies a long time ago is that they actually went out and spoke to people who are poor. They actually asked them, what is poverty? What does poverty mean to you? And that's when this idea, this rich response that came back about the multidimensional nature of poverty. People were describing themselves in ways which were alien to policymakers. Everybody looked at income, you looked at whether you were employed or unemployed, but they talked about different things. And lo and behold, things like shame. Who ever thought about shame? But shame is such a powerful factor in a poor person's life. It's beyond their control. And the system discriminates against people and creates a sense of shame. They have a sense of failure. I think there's nothing worse than somebody who's looking for public assistance or social security when they go there and they have to justify that they're poor. You know, they have these measures to say, how poor are you? Are you really poor enough? You know, how bad is it that before we can give you, or we're going to give you something, but you got to do something for us. You know, you got to look for work, or you have to do something else. You have to volunteer and do some public service, community service. So that all creates a sense of shame. And there's a lot of work now going on looking at the impact of shame within society. They see people as being undeserving of public assistance. So and this other point is clearly what I just talked about, that it makes for better policy making when you have multidimensional measures of poverty. So this begs the question now, if you have multidimensional poverty, you have these global initiatives and targets, and then you have poverty itself being so complex and being so nuanced. Right? We have to get away from the simplicity or a simple idea that poverty can be overcome by growth. You know, you have this trickle-down impact. If you have enough growth in the economy, then everybody will rise with the tide. All the ships will rise. But that's not going to happen. So you really have to try to reach people in poverty. And why is that? Because most of them are invisible. And I've just off the top of my head, you can have half a dozen, 2 dozen. The main ones are a lot of poor people are undocumented. If you think about what's happened in the US, if you're an immigrant, you disappear. You want to become invisible, right? In other places, they're socially excluded or they're discriminated. And then if you are really poor and you're living in the boondocks somewhere, you're geographically isolated. It takes days to get to the city. Nobody knows who you are. Nobody cares what happens to you. And then people are ignorant of their rights. That's a very, very important reason why they're invisible. They don't know they have their rights. They don't dare stand up and speak. And then if they do know their rights, they have no platform. Where do you speak? Who's going to listen to you? Right? You may know your rights. Or if they have a platform, their views are ignored. Nobody listens to you. And then you begin to see some of the skills that you are aware of in education diplomacy. Listening, right? Being able to be empathetic. Right? So these are the skills that you can carry into the field to reach people in poverty. And especially when you're dealing with education in poor countries, in the poor areas, you're going to be dealing with people who have all these characteristics. And parents actually transfer a lot of this sense of shame and so on to the kids. And they caution them, you know, don't make yourself too obvious. Or if things get bad, they just take the kids out of school. That's one of the many reasons why poor people don't send their kids to school, because that shame and embarrassment comes back from school. Let me tell you a little bit about the international movement, 80 Fourth World, whom I work with. And one of the things they are very good at is reaching people in poverty. So if you don't know much about 80 Fourth World, I'll just run through this. They're a non-profit organization which works to eradicate poverty through a human rights-based approach. So the fundamental thing that they fight for is human rights. And it's interesting, they don't work in cities, and they work directly in the communities of people living in poverty. They're right there with them, living with them. Now, they survive because they have volunteers who get paid the minimum wage in the country they work in. That's the only compensation they have. And they're right there. And what they do is they try to work in partnership, build trust. Again, another good skill that comes out from education diplomacy, the things that you do as a good diplomat. You create solidarity, and there's mutual respect. You can't hope to reach people if you don't have mutual respect. You can't go in and be the one that has all the good ideas. You can't be the one that never listens. And this point is extremely important. When they live with the people in their communities, they always indicate that they recognize and value their contributions, their knowledge. People have very good local knowledge, but nobody ever bothers to ask them, how is it you do something? You know, why is that successful? Right. And together with people in poverty, they defend their rights and human dignity. At the international level, 84th World works with poor people to be represented in the multilateral organizations. So they have an office in New York working with the UN, UNESCO, they're very strong there. Human Rights Commission, they're there too as well. Now, they're not people who just front up. They're not the only people who's, at every opportunity, they get poor people themselves to actually come and join them on the podium and to be part of the conversation. To date, they operate in 32 countries, and then through the Forum for Overcoming Extreme Poverty, they have links in 146 countries. They don't have a lot of money, but because they use this huge core of volunteers, they're able to achieve a lot to change people's lives. And there's another misunderstanding about the organization. It was founded by a Catholic priest, Joseph Brzezinski. But despite this, the origins of the organization, it is non-religious, it's apolitical. Now, one of the things that Joseph Brzezinski did was he said, how do you highlight the plight of poor people, and how do you create the solidarity among poor people and the rest of society? So he decided in the early 80s to begin to create this movement of people, and he tried to get them to rally around one day a year where people had the opportunity to be free to speak openly and freely. So that was October 1987, where he got 100,000 people, not only poor people, from all walks of life, and they went to the Trocadero Human Rights Plaza where they signed the declaration. And if you go to Paris, don't ever miss the opportunity not to visit that site. And you'll see this huge stone. It's inscribed, wherever men and women are condemned to live in poverty, human rights are violated, to come together to ensure that these rights be respected is our solemn duty. Right, so that's a very moving, and it's got the best spot on the Trocadero Plaza. And understandably, in France, they're a huge supporter of Poverty Day. Now, it's not often that you have an NGO with a movement that gets the UN to begin to recognize it. And it wasn't really, it's very long after they had the first day that the UN recognized October 17th as the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. So now it's an official UN day, and member states around the world are encouraged to mark the day. And every October 17th around the world, people get together to honor people living in poverty and to renew the commitment. It's not a platform for people to talk about the work they've done. You don't partake of charity. It's not a day to handouts, to give handouts or to provide food. It's not that sort of a day, okay? When very often we have charities who want to mark the day, and they're very, very keen to show their solidarity with people living in poverty, but they want to make sandwiches and they want to give, gifts and food and so on. And we tell them, no, that's not the whole purpose. You can have a meal and you can sit down and have lunch together, but the whole purpose is that you actually talk to one another, right? That you recommit on that day, that you listen to what poor people have to say, and you'll be surprised. They're not, poor people don't come there and bitch and grouse. They're not going to say, oh, the government has let us down. They never say that. They'll say, look, I'm so and so, I've come from here, and these are the problems that I've had in my community, and this is how we've tried so hard to overcome these problems, right? And these are the people who have helped me, or I've helped someone. And that's the tone of that day. So this was Joseph Brzezinski's, one of his plans to try to raise the profile and to make poor people less invisible, but also to create solidarity between poor people and non-poor people. So here we have, that's the stone. That's just a marker stone. The actual stone is there behind here. And that's somebody speaking at our ceremony. And that's Ban Ki-moon last year. He actually connected with a child from a poor family. So, links to education diplomacy. When I talk to people about poverty eradication, I always like to ask this question. When was the last time you actually spoke to somebody living in poverty? Can I have a show of hands? That's excellent. Because very often when I go to ask them, I ask this question in a lot of forums, people say, I hardly see a show of hands. Because they're invisible. Or if you pass somebody who's a homeless person on the streets, it's not because you're a bad person, but poverty affects us and homelessness affects us in very strange ways, because it affects our own insecurity. Because if things didn't turn out well, then we might just be there, right? And it scares us. But in order to reach people in poverty, you have to take that final step, go that extra mile, begin to generate a little bit more empathy. It's hard work. And you're not a bad person if you find it difficult. Everybody finds it difficult to actually connect with someone, because there's a lot of fear. All right? And it's not the fear of that person, but the fear within ourselves that we could well be there in that situation if things had changed. Now, one of the interesting things that the HED Fourth World thought about and has worked, and this has a direct link to educational diplomacy, is the concept of merging of knowledge. And this is when you connect with people living in poverty and you begin to see your learned skills with their acquired skills. How can you blend that to better improve the way that you interact with people living in poverty? It's hard to conceive that, because you have an educational system and you go to school as teachers, you want to train people. You may get some feedback from your students and your colleagues, but people living in poverty probably haven't been to school, right? Can't read or write. What knowledge do they have? How can they contribute to the learning process? They can, because if you begin to think about this merging knowledge technique. So what we do is we get them together, get everybody together, and then people begin to see that you may speak differently, you may think differently, because they see problems from a different viewpoint. They work from life experience, and they gain as well by having this acquiring knowledge from people who actually are experts in their field or who are highly qualified. And what it does is it begins to create an environment where there's respect and patience between when you communicate. Very often when you listen to somebody who's really unsure of what's going on, we get very impatient. You try to complete the sentences for them, right? Has that happened to you? When somebody's grasping for a word and saying, oh, let's fill that in. One of the lessons you learn from merging knowledge is that you allow that person to have the time and space to begin to develop the ideas. And very often when you have these meetings for 2 or 3 days at a time, and you can see this visible change. First, they start out and they don't dare speak. They're afraid to talk. Why? Because they might be judged. We have to stop being judgmental, because people say, oh, you're stupid, right? The first instinct is that if somebody can't respond or can't think in the way we do, then they're stupid or they're ignorant, right? So that understanding is needed in order to create this inclusive process, how we include people despite the lack of training, despite having experience in the field that we're talking about. You were going to talk about sustainable development to somebody living in poverty, they're going to go blank, right? Very often, we tried, one of the experiments we had was when we talked about governance. People living in poverty had never heard of the word governance, had no idea what it meant, but after 3 days, they came back and said, I never knew the word governance, but it applies to me. It applies to my community. This is how I see it. And you begin to see this personal growth. And then in turn, those of us who assume that we have helped to define the word governance, or we've used it or taught it, now we begin to see it from a different light. So that merging of knowledge is extremely important. So one of the useful tools we have is something called People's University. So it's one step further from it's the exploitation, implementation of this merging of knowledge process. And we get groups of people together formally. So they'll meet, and anybody can organize this. If you have a group of people within your community who are deprived, who are discriminated, or who are, somehow socially excluded, you can bring them together and create your own People's University. Anywhere. It could be in your community center, it could be in your home. They get together and they talk about certain issues. One of the key things that we spoke about in New York was the stop and frisk policy of the NYPD. Why? Because the communities that we are talking to, they were the ones who were most affected. Their kids couldn't walk to the subway station without being stopped by the cops. Right? So we had to understand how they felt about it, what solutions they could offer. Now, where would there be a forum for them to discuss this? So the People's University is one excellent mechanism which is informal and which can be developed quite quickly within your community. It doesn't cost anything. So that's when you begin to exploit their knowledge and experience and the work that they don't have an avenue to get that work out. So I think this is a really good example of how education diplomacy can work. And it's useful too, because then they may not have access to information, or they may have a view that can be modified if they had more information, right? Because they're on the receiving end, they see the world from a different perspective. And if you begin to explain to them what is happening, why it's happening, and what can be done to overcome that, then you get feedback in terms of how the solutions can be created and how they can be implemented. Yes. The interesting thing at the UN is when we have the October 17th celebrations, everybody's equal. And one of the things we try, normally when you have these meetings at the UN, all these officials, the ambassadors will sit on the podium, everybody else, the nobodies, sit in the crowd, right? We turn the tables around on October 17th. We'll get a couple of presenters, and they'll be up on the podium, and then the ambassadors will sit in the crowd. Unfortunately, last year, we got the Secretary General to come, and he came for the first time. He didn't understand what was going on. So he sent this directive from his office, I've got to sit on the podium, first instruction. And the second instruction is, you're going to have an odd number on the podium because I need to sit in the center. So the United Nations is his house, right? He's the boss. So we tried to reason with his staff, but no, that wasn't instructed. So he came and he actually sat on the podium. And then he noticed that the ambassadors who normally sit in the crowd weren't very happy. And by the end of the day, we saw that he's changed his attitude, because he said, oh, there's something wrong. People are not very happy with me doing this, you know. So I think then this year, if he comes this year, then he might consent to actually sitting in the crowd and being with the people. The other thing that we've tried to do to sensitize ambassadors and people in positions of authority is that we actually try to get them to meet with people who are in need. Because they spend their whole life meeting other ambassadors, meeting powerful people, and it's all in the name of eradicating poverty, trying to get to the vulnerable, you know, and they have all these stock phrases that they use. Then ask them the question, when was the last time you spoke to somebody living in poverty, you know? And the answer probably is, it's no. So that's the opportunity that you have with this October 7th. I would encourage you, you know, that it does cost you nothing. In your schools or whatever, you have an opportunity. Try to raise awareness of the day and get this happening. That you know, there's probably a homeless person who's living around the street from the corner from your school. If on that day you bring them in and you actually speak to the children, that's this, you know, then you begin to see what they can, how privileged they are, what they can do, the little things they can do to help overcome the situation. Yeah. So this is the other slide that I didn't put up before we got into that. You see, some of the benefits also, the main benefit of this is the people without direct experience of poverty, you know, they also get involved and they speak to people on an equal footing, especially people in positions of authority. They're very used to giving instructions or giving direction, and being a leader is so important, being a leader. You know, but in emerging knowledge, you don't have a leader. There's no leadership because we are a group. We're trying to find a solution in a collaborative, cooperative manner. And it provides an opportunity. Very infrequently, you actually have people from the one end of the spectrum to the other end where they get together and meet. Not often. It was interesting when de Blasio first became mayor of New York. For all his shortcomings, one of the things he did was he actually had venues where all New Yorkers come in. You know, you could just participate in dialogue. You go on to computers, and I don't know, there might be some people, New Yorkers here, who actually took part in those. I certainly did, and they had an opportunity where people could share and look at what is being planned, give some ideas and criticisms. So that's a website that we have for Poverty Day, Overcoming Poverty, and this is the committee that I work with, and the idea is that the committee supports the commemoration of International Day around the world. It's basically a gathering of people where you bring people living in poverty together with the rest of the community. You are inclusive. You don't exclude them. So that's a day when you bring them and you listen to them. You give them a platform where they can begin to talk about their lives. They can talk about their aspirations. They can talk about anything they want to. But we don't bring public officials. Let's say if you're having it in the university, you don't bring the rector or the president to come and make a formal speech and then disappear, right? So we would have people who would organize the day, and we would have testimonies. We call them testimonies. People come and provide testimony because they will speak either on their behalf or on behalf of some people who can't make it there. So one year, and a lot of tears are shed during these commemorations. I have one of these senior UN officials in my department, and of course he had to go and read the Secretary General's message for the day because the Secretary General couldn't make it himself. And then he sat down and he listened to these testimonies, and at that time we had two women from forget the country, in South America, and they came and they talked about how the recent floods in the country had destroyed their homes under bridges. You know, and it was statements from the heart, and they didn't accuse anybody of anything. They just said, look, you talk about the floods, this is what happened to us, and we are trying to overcome this using our resources, but sometimes it's pretty hard, you know, but you have to understand why we are poor. We're not because you're not lazy or we don't do enough, but these are things that happen. And so, you know, you get people who are moved by that. And we don't encourage people to talk about the good things they've done as well. You don't get somebody say, look, I've given, you know, 200,000 to build this home for homeless people. You don't do that, no. You don't give charity as well. It's a dialogue. So you bring them together and they talk about their lives, they talk about the day, what it means to them, and they talk about human rights. Right? And that's, for us, October 17th is every day of the year. But the day itself is the day when, if they don't have an opportunity the other 364 days, they have it on that day. It's guaranteed on that day. They have a platform on that day. It is their day. Right? But it doesn't mean that it stops there. So when you have your event, wherever you want to have it, it's not a big formal event. It's open to everyone, but you would encourage people who normally would not meet people living in poverty to come and meet them, talk about, and out of these discussions, you can have things that happen. Because how would you know about what the problems people are facing? If somebody says, look, I've been looking for a job, in the New York Commemoration, there's a person who said, look, I've been trying to get this job as a cab driver, but I can't get a job as a cab driver because in New York City, once you've had one offense recorded against your name, you can't get employed as a cab driver. And he said, that happened 30 years ago when I was a kid. I didn't know what I was doing. I made a mistake. I've led a good life, then I never got into trouble ever since, but I still can't get a job as a cab driver. Now, if he hadn't talked about that, there was somebody in the audience who said, look, we'll do something about that. He was a lawyer. Let's do something about that. So you begin this dialogue. If you don't have that dialogue, that's a starting point. So that's what we like to do. It's a starting point. It goes on to merging of knowledge. It goes on to the People's University. People's University is when you begin to carry this idea of October 17th into the rest of the year. And it's not as if you have to have it every month. You have it when people want to, because people are busy. You have to have it at a time which suits people who have to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs a day, right? They don't have as much free time, and if you have it in the evening, sometimes they're tired. So you really have to work with them to figure out what suits them. But if you do get somebody who's important to come, you have to tell them, no, you're not talking, right? You have to tell the person who's important, you're here to listen. You're here to show your solidarity. It's hard. It's very hard. And you have to encourage the people who haven't spoken in public to speak. You can use all kinds of devices. What we do is we also encourage people to write essays. They write poetry. They can read out the poetry. There are artists who draw, musicians, and they express it in many ways. So you should encourage all of that. Especially children. We have a very strong movement. We call it Tapori movement. It's the children themselves. And they are supported by street libraries and things. So a lot of devices you can do. But the lessons that go through those activities is that it's human rights, it's dignity, it's learning to listen, it's learning to work as a community. The things we're doing here is non-political. We're not blaming governments. We're not rebelling against the order. We're actually working within society to change the order from within. And we're doing it by changing people's lives. And how do you change their lives? By recognizing their dignity and empowering them. You know, by treating them as decent human beings. And that's when they can begin to grow and begin to develop. And a lot of it is self-help. A lot of the people that we work with eventually become volunteers themselves. And we like to call them activists. Right? And they become really active within their communities. They go around and they talk about human rights. You know, they go around, they spread the word about how things can change if, you know, they change themselves. You know, it's not only being aware of human rights, but being allowed to take that change. So the fact that we are non-political, I think it's a lot easier, and we don't set goals because we're working with people in communities. The success is when communities become successful and they lift themselves out of poverty. And it's a sustainable escape from poverty because you set in place the things that enable them to rise out of poverty.